During the Second World War, thousands of people, both soldiers and civilians, were executed by German firing squads. These executions were conducted by the Wehrmacht, the SS or police units, and were a grim and calculated feature of Nazi-occupied Europe. They were designed not only to punish but to enforce discipline and terrorise populations. The procedure was highly regulated, chillingly efficient, and followed a pattern that blended military formality with ideological brutality. Firing squad executions were officially used by the German military to punish desertion, cowardice, defeatism, or treason amongst soldiers. They were also used against partisans, political prisoners, and civilians accused of aiding resistance movements in occupied countries. According to the records from the Wehrmacht's Feldgericht, the field courts, more than 30,000 German soldiers were executed by their own military between 1939 and 1945, mostly in the latter years of the war. Civilian executions, often carried out by the SS and the Ordnungspolizei, the order police, numbered in the hundreds of thousands across Eastern Europe. Executions could occur almost anywhere, in military zones, barrack yards, quarries, forests, or concentration camp perimeters. Public executions of soldiers were sometimes ordered to deter desertion. In occupied areas, they were meant to crush resistance. This was explicitly encouraged by Hitler's 1942 directive on draconian discipline, which gave officers authority to execute without delay. Within the Wehrmacht, soldiers accused of capital offences were tried by court-martial. Early in the war, these trials had some form of legal procedure, but by 1943 to 1944, as Germany began losing, the process became much harsher. Trials often lasted only minutes, with little evidence or defence permitted. Deserters or those accused of cowardice before the enemy were most at risk. Under Hitler's decree for maintaining discipline, commanders were urged to make examples of soldiers who faltered. Civilians, on the other hand, were rarely given any trial. The Gestapo or SS frequently issued execution orders directly under summary justice, especially in anti-partisan operations. Victims were often told only moments before that they were about to die. Once the death sentence was issued, preparations began very quickly. A location was selected, preferably secluded but accessible. If possible, a burial trench or pit was prepared in advance, often by other prisoners. The execution squad usually consisted of 6 to 12 soldiers. In Wehrmacht procedure, this detail was often drawn from the condemned's own unit, to emphasise obedience and unity under military law. The squad's rifles were typically standard issue Carabiner 98K, bolt-action rifles. In some cases, one or more of the rifles were loaded with blanks, an old European military tradition meant to reduce psychological trauma, leaving doubt about who fired the fatal shot. However, this was inconsistently applied in Nazi Germany, and many squads used only live rounds. The condemned's final moments varied depending on their status. A German soldier might spend his last hours in a guardhouse, sometimes allowed to write a final letter or see a priest or chaplain. Wehrmacht records show that some were even granted last rites by a Protestant or Catholic clergyman. In occupied territories, however, civilian prisoners, especially Jews, resistance members, or partisans, were shown no compassion. They were often beaten, humiliated, and paraded before being shot. Shortly before the execution, the condemned were brought to the site under heavy guard. In formal cases, an officer would read the death sentence before witnesses. Military witnesses might include the court officer, a doctor, and a commanding officer. In less formal or SS-led executions, none of these formalities were followed. At the site, the condemned was positioned either standing, kneeling, or tied to a post or stake. A blindfold was sometimes offered, but not always accepted. Some prisoners refused it, wishing to face the death with dignity. The firing squad lined up approximately 5 to 10 metres away. The squad commander, usually an officer or sergeant, stood to one side. Behind them stood the supervising officer, whose duty was to ensure the sentence was properly carried out. The squad aimed at the chest, specifically over the heart. German military execution guidelines, derived from earlier Prussian procedure, emphasised on an instant clean kill. When multiple prisoners were to be shot, they might be lined up in groups. Civilian mass executions, particularly in Eastern Europe, could involve dozens or even hundreds of victims at once, such as at Babi Yar in Ukraine or Panari in Lithuania, though those were typically carried out by the SS and police battalions, not regular Wehrmacht court executions. The officer in charge issued the standard German firing commands. First, Achtung, attention. Second, fertig machen, make ready. Third, zielen, aim. And then finally, Feuer, fire. At the final command, the squad fired a simultaneous volley. The sound was deafening, the shock instantaneous. If the condemned survived the volley, the officer or an appointed soldier delivered the Gnadenschuss, mercy shot, a pistol shot to the back of the head, usually fired between the ear or through the temple. A Wehrmacht medical officer or NCO then confirmed death. Afterwards, the body was buried either in the prepared grave or nearby. If the condemned was a soldier, burial could occur with limited ceremony, sometimes even with a cross bearing only initials or the word gefallen, fallen. For civilians and resistance fighters, graves were often unmarked or mass graves were used. The officer in charge filed a written execution report noting the date and location, the names of the squad members, confirmation of death by the medical officer, and a copy of the court sentence. Families of executed Wehrmacht soldiers might receive a brief impersonal letter stating that their relative was executed for desertion or shot for cowardice. For victims of SS or Gestapo shootings, families were often never informed at all. Many firing squad members suffered long-term trauma. Diaries and post-war testimonies describe nightmares, guilt and emotional numbness. Historian Wolfram Vetter notes that while most soldiers complied, some begged to be excused, risking charges of disobedience. Others rationalised the killings as duty or ideology. In units fighting in the East, particularly during anti-partisan operations, the distinction between judicial execution and mass murder blurred completely. Wehrmacht troops, SS men and police battalions often collaborated in shootings of civilians under the guise of reprisal or discipline. By 1944-45, as the war turned against Germany, executions increased dramatically. Hitler ordered that desertion be punished immediately, and mobile field courts issued thousands of death sentences. In April 1945 alone, over 1,500 German soldiers were executed for desertion or defeatism. After the war, Allied tribunals investigated numerous firing squad executions. Some were deemed legitimate under military law, but most were found to be arbitrary or politically motivated killings. Sites of mass executions like Riga, Minsk and Warsaw became key evidence of Nazi war crimes. In post-war Germany, remembrance of these victims took decades. Only in the 1990s did the German government officially rehabilitate Wehrmacht deserters, recognising them as victims of Nazi injustice rather than traitors. A Wehrmacht or German firing squad execution was both a military act and an instrument of terror. The procedure was precise, from sentencing to the commands to the final mercy shot. But beyond the discipline and formality lay cruelty, fear, and the moral destruction of those involved. Whether carried out against deserters or civilians, these executions symbolised the totalitarian control of the Nazi regime, where obedience outweighed humanity, and where one shouted word, Feuer, ended a life in the name of the state. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.